space.
Okay, well, everyone, welcome, welcome, welcome. Welcome. Thank you for being here for the SSPI-WISE All Members meeting. This is a public gathering. We're looking forward to a really phenomenal conversation with some very phenomenal women. I'm Tamara Von Williams, Executive Director for SSPI, and I am going to introduce my good friend, Katina Mruk. Katina, I don't think I've actually ever known how to pronounce your name, so if I just butchered it, please correct me. 'Cause I think I said it right, but I've never asked you, so I should fix that. But she's gonna lead this conversation I wrote down the exact title. But anyway, I'm a little scatterbrained, so I'm not gonna try it. I'm not gonna butcher it. I'm gonna introduce Katina. And Katina is going to tell us some more. And I'll tell you a little bit about Katina. Katina works for RKF Engineering. Is it RKS Engineering LLC or Systems or Technologies? I keep getting this wrong.
Yeah, all
Classic.
good. Well, I'm gonna throw another change at you. So, I'm Katina. I'm the Associate Director of Strategy and Transactions at RKF Engineering. We're based over in Bethesda, right outside Washington, D.C. And as of this month, RKF Engineering is also a Aurea space company. So, Tamara, another change to kind of throw at you there. But
Okay, we
yeah.
clearly have to talk.
Yeah, so our RKF is entering a new chapter and going to be kind of growing and expanding with the Aurea space team
Oh,
this year. So it'll
gosh.
be exciting. Yeah.
Very, very exciting. Well, congratulations on that. And yes, we have to talk. So, okay. So Katina, I will leave it to you to introduce the panel and our lovely panelists, and I will bring them on screen as you introduce them. How's that?
All right. Sounds good. I'll do some quick intros and then we'll kind of kick off with the panelists doing a bit of their own intro. So today we have Dr. Alice Bunn, the International Director over at the UK Space Agency. Um, Joining us, we also have Laura Stefani, Managing Partner and Founder of Trailfinding Regulatory Solutions, Karen Cox, the Chief of Corporate Affairs at LeoLabs, and Meagan Sunn. She's the Senior Director of Government Affairs at ICE Miller. And today we're kicking off the new year with talking about space and satellite industry uh, regulations, policies, and best practices and industry trends to keep our eye on in the upcoming year. As we all know, being in the space and satellite industry, uh, your DNA is kind of equal parts technical as it is regulatory. So it's always good to kind of get a refresher on what's happening in that domain and understanding how that's shaping the years ahead. So with that, I'd like to kind of flip it over to Dr. Bunn so she can give her own intro. And from there, we'll go to Laura, Karen, and then Megan.
Thank you, Katina. This is going to sound like the world's most public, career update, but I also need to offer a title correction because I'm no longer the international director of the UK Space Agency. I was a number of years ago. So let's just say I've had over 25 years experience working in the space sector. 8 significant roles: international director at the Space Agency. I was until recently CEO at the Institution of Mechanical Engineers. I am currently the president of the UK Space Trade Association. That's me.
A lot to keep up with. Thank you for the update. And how is that new role?
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting, isn't it? I think over the last few years, when we think, coming to the topic of today's session, when we think about regulation, when we think about the challenges of space, increasingly, I think we see the challenge of the sustainability of the operating environment really, really come to the fore. And you can see various reactions around the world. I think, um, I think for most of us, we're not responding quickly enough but we are starting to see some response to this challenge, be that some sanctions coming in for operators who don't behave responsibility, be that some innovation in our regulatory frameworks to enable the safe testing of technology. But for me, that's remains the number one challenge for our future space missions.
Yep. And incredibly relevant to our discussion today. With that, Laura, would you like to introduce yourself as well?
Yeah, thanks for having me too. So I'm a US based regulatory lawyer by training and practice, several decades of experience supporting new and emerging satellite and wireless technologies. M- that basically means a lot of work before the Federal Communications Commission, sometimes NTIA, which is the US Federal Spectrum Management Agency, and then a host of other um, DC based agencies. My work started supporting kind of traditional geos, and that has morphed into kind of newer types of technologies, including direct to handsets and various earth stations and motions and small sats sensing technologies. My most recent work before I started my own firm was to co-chair a telecommunications practice group at a large DC-based law firm.
Thank you, Laura. We're excited to have you here and excited that you're also striking out on your own and putting that entrepreneurial hat on these last few months. So that'll be an interesting journey to watch as well.
Yeah, it's been fun.
An interesting perspective to bring as well. Yeah, welcome. Karen.
Good morning, I guess afternoon on the East Coast. Thank you so much for having me. So I'm Karen Cox. I'm the corporate affairs officer for LeoLabs. I've been with the company just about a year and a half after spending about a decade at Maxar previously. As corporate affairs officer, I lead a cross-functional team, so it's really government relations and the Marcom function. So not a lawyer, coming to you more from the government relations and policy side today. I get to represent Leo Labs on this panel, so just a little bit about the company. But we really pride ourselves on being a leading mission partner for persistent orbital intelligence. So we work with military space command, civil agencies, and commercial operators really across the board to kind of help detect, track, characterize satellites and try to make sure that stays sustainable and safe for everyone. So, but again, thank you for having me today.
Yeah, welcome, Karen. And I think a lot of the work that Leo Labs does is going to kind of play in really nicely with what Dr. Bunn was kind of talking about as well, as far as sustainability of the operating environment. So it'll be interesting kind of as we get into our discussion today. Meagan, welcome, our final panelist. Let's learn a little bit more about you. I guess for the sake of the audience, we've already spoken, but
Absolutely.
please introduce yourself. Thank you.
Absolutely. So my name is Meagan Sunn. I'm a senior director of government affairs at Ice Miller. We're a full service national law firm based in Indiana, but I serve our DC office. My practice is a bit of a mix between Lauren and Karen's in that I spent some time in both chambers on Capitol Hill, serving U.S. Senator Gary Peters on the Senate Commerce Committee, so crafting legislation around tech, telecom, and space policy. And then I also served the House Small Business Committee as their tech and telecom counsel. Prior to that, I worked primarily in broadband deployment at the Universal Service Administrative Company and also at the FCC. In my practice today, I serve clients, large and small clients, around licensing issues and advocacy issues around tech and telecom. In particular, obviously, really interested in digging into conversations with this group around spectrum allocation, and the next steps for space technology. So very happy and feel special to be a part of this esteemed group.
Yeah, welcome, Megan. We're happy to have you here. So with that, it's been an exciting last few years, especially here in the US with some changes that are underway. But of course, there are changes kind of emerging everywhere, including the UK. I guess for our panelists, the first kind of question is what are you really keeping your eye on this year? What regulation, policy, or industry best practice do you see emerging, or would you like to see kind of more or less of heading into the year? Um, I guess, Karen. Yeah.
I'll maybe if I could just set the stage because I like data. But for Leo, I thought I would just throw out some of the numbers on kind of the launch cadence and the number of satellites that are actually going up because I think as we talk today, it's really important to not only think about what space looks like today, right? But what it's going to look like in a year, 5 year, 10 years. And the cadence of launches and satellites are just exponentially growing. So um there was 232 launches into Leo in 2025, which was a 10% increase over 2024, which was record setting. The object population in Leo right now is over 26,000 objects, and that's just objects that are over 10 centimeters. 50% of those are satellites. 3,700 objects were launched into Leo in 2025. Um, I think at the beginning of 2025, there was kind of estimates of about 70,000 satellites in orbit by 2030. But then China just filed ITU paperwork to launch 200,000 satellites. So again, I think as we think about policy today and sort of shaping some of these regulations, it's really important to keep in mind that space is I hate to say there, but it's about to explode. That's probably not the right word to use, but the exponential growth is so important. So for LeoLabs, some of the things we're really watching is obviously the policies and regulations around space traffic management. This isn't necessarily a policy, but what the government does with the TRACS program, which is the traffic coordination system for space. I think probably all of you are watching that. It's really the FAA of space, but seeing what this administration and the Department of Commerce really turns that into, I think will be very important. Meagan, this is something you may have worked on, but the Safe Orbit Act didn't quite get passed, but something that's going to codify some space traffic management standards and how the government is putting forth these programs to really get ahead, or if you can say ahead, we're really probably behind, but to really make sure that space is safe going forward. So those are our two probably big pushes.
I'll jump in and Laura, you probably have maybe some more in-depth thoughts on this, but in October of last year, the FCC issued an NPRM around Part 100 and rewriting some of those rules around space activities and really sort of putting some teeth around the Space Bureau at the FCC and how they will look at managing safety in space. I think this is a really exciting time to be an advocate in this space, particularly I would imagine for Karen representing LeoLabs and sort of forming that process, especially with the understanding that there are going to be so many more satellites, LEO satellites that'll be in orbit. I don't know if anyone else wanted to chime in on that.
Yeah, I'll address that. I mean, I think as uh, policy geek and an advocate and someone who's kind of spectrum focused, there's kind of two major things I'm looking at. And so one is just generally a pretty large, robust agenda that the FCC's Space Bureau is dealing with, including what you just mentioned, the a wholesale proposed rewrite of their licensing rules for space and Earth stations. And then also they're looking at some important spectrum issues involving the 28, 37, and 38.9 gigahertz frequency bands. And then they're also continuing to work on the realignment of the C-band. And then in addition to that, the White House just put out an executive order in December, which they call on the future of American space superiority is the word that they use. And that's directing quite a number of agencies to look at what's needed in the short and middle term to do a large number of things, including establish a base on the moon, getting to Mars, and generally protecting America's national security in space, including the replacement of like ISS. So to some extent, these two sets of activities probably have some inherent tension in that there's only so many resources in the US government, especially considering the paring down of the US government that we've seen with the administration's actions trying to reduce the number of employees in the government. As a policy geek, it'll be interesting to see what actually gets done. As an advocate, I would definitely want to kind of have a client pull together as many resources as they could to make sure that what they need to get done gets done.
Yeah, maybe I can just jump in as well because really interesting observations from the panel so far, and for me, I think we have to be humble about the level of awareness of space in the population at large. But if we're looking forwards, I certainly hope we'll come to a time when consumer choice is quite important too, and consumer choice will. I would hope, spoiler alert, I am a born optimist, that, consumer choice will mean that those operators that are operating safely and sustainably will be the successful operators in the future because the consumers, the public at large will be part of that drive. Um, the level of awareness is really low. I had one of my most shocking conversations for a while this week when I was talking to someone, just by way of example, from the environment community. And I was thinking, this is fantastic. We've got so much to talk about. The measuring essential climate variables, the incredible power of, space for managing our environment. And their position was, their starting point was, how do we stop space being the next environmental catastrophe that hits Earth? And I was like, wow. And this person was completely unaware of the power of space for environmental management. Now, I hope that in my small part, I have now reversed his opinion 180, and he will also be now a big advocate. But, the job ahead is big. The job ahead is big to still convince the public at large the importance of space programs to everyone, civil or defense, and therefore to then convince the public of the importance of the future of our operating environment. And therefore, I would hope that consumer choice comes into this at some point. It's interesting for me, sitting in Europe, but not sitting as part of the EU now, looking at some of the measures that are coming out of the EU to encourage the adoption of sustainable space operations. They're very, very worthy in intention. I think they also risk creating quite a market distortion globally because, forgive me, someone, I think it was Meagan that mentioned it earlier, thinking about standards, thinking about interoperability, thinking about the way in which countries all around the world are going to have to work together is going to be really, really important.
Yeah, and I think I just wanted to add, I love what you said about consumer choice because in addition to the EO around space, there was also an executive order late in December around the 6G race. And I think that people forget that satellite technology is a part of that mosaic to get us there, right? We just had a meeting with a number of our partners that came from around the country, and some of them live in rural parts of America. And they talked about having, access to wireless internet technology via a hotspot, but also sort of needing a satellite solution in order to be able to have access to the internet at all times. So I think, as we're having conversations around spectrum reallocation, right? I think there's a lot of talk around moving some of the spectrum that satellite license holders use for license spectrum for terrestrial wireless technology. I think we should have more of a conversation about how satellite is a part of that mix.
I love that, and I love the fact that these conversations are just playing out in exactly the same way, whichever side of the Atlantic you are, right? And I mean, 10 years ago when it was all, thinking about 5G, I'd sit around this table and there's conversations are about they wouldn't treat 5G as a state of connectivity. They treat it as a technology solution. And exactly to your point, you find yourself time and time again saying, no, 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 all these technologies come together as part of the solution to achieve that state of connectivity. They are not in competition with each other necessarily, although when it comes to spectrum allocation, of course, they may be. But in my experience, that conversation has moved on so much in the last 10 years. I mean, in my experience, the space community have done very, very well to land the argument about just how important that space connectivity component is. So that's a little thing to celebrate, at least.
I was just gonna say it's been not just 10 years, I think it's been at least 25 years of fighting, by folks that advocate for the space industry, to kinda get us to be thinking of wireless and satellites in the same conversations, and obviously the direct to mobile, initiatives are helping that conversation, but I still think it's gonna be a continued fight by space advocates.
Yeah. Um, and creating kind of a communications ecosystem and thinking of it more so maybe in that way rather than the technology that's delivering that connectivity, right? Typically the end user, right? They want to be connected and they don't always necessarily um, wonder how it's all working, right? It's kind of a little bit of magic still. So with that, I think we have kind of a lot to go on here, even just from this recent this discussion here. So I think a couple of the things I heard. Let's see. Uh, so it does sound like there are a few different ways to kind of move forward with how the industry is going to continue to be shaped. It sounds um, almost like there are sometimes private solutions versus purely public solutions, and then uh, maybe even joint public-private endeavors, kind of like, for example, I think Karen mentioned tracks and how LeoLabs is kind of one of the pioneering spearheading companies that is focusing on that space situational awareness and kind of this always on, always tracking uh, ability and having that ability for commercial, but also for government is important. And I think that really ties in nicely to the space sustainability conversation as well. So um, I guess let's kind of go there for a minute. There were a couple other things I'd like to kind of bounce back to as well eventually, but um, I guess what do we do we think the answer is or could be uh, moving forward? Is a private market solution the way to go, especially with orbital debris and kind of defunct satellites, or is there kind of a need for regulation or policy at the country or global level?
we could probably kick off with a couple thoughts as it relates to, again, kind of the space traffic management piece. But we kind of think better together a little bit with the public private partnerships. Really, I mean, LeoLabs certainly does have a commercial offering, right? We work just commercially with companies like SpaceX, Maxar, Black Sky. But as Trax develops, to have that be a public service that's based or uses foundational commercial data as a starting point, right? And really built out from there, um, can really provide an effective service, not only for US satellite operators, but Dr. Bunn, as we start to really think about how to coordinate internationally with entities like the EUSST. And I think eventually, there's going to have to be policies around how we do work with China, right? Or don't work with China on that coordination because space doesn't have a lot of borders, right? But to have a really strong, kind of start at home, I like to say, and with a strong public private partnership. I would also say that I think we've seen successful instances where the government, being the public part, right, can really take advantage of that private investment. And with kind of longer term contracts, more transparency into these programs, more set programs, like you're going to spur this innovation and this private capital right now that we're seeing all across the space industry to really invest in these capabilities and really make it a strong program and partnership. So, again, I kind of think better together, but welcome other thoughts.
Yeah, I love the better together. Yeah. I think, let's be straightforward. I think it's got to start with the data, hasn't it? And for reasons we all well understand, the data has not been easily shared up until this point. And I think there comes a tipping point where, you have more to gain by sharing the data than you have to lose. And I think it's, sometimes you can fall into the trap of thinking you have some kind of a unique problem. And usually history is your friend here, right? Usually something has happened in history where there's something similar. And guess what? A solution has been found. And now people forget there was even a problem in the past. One of the most fascinating conferences um, I attended was a joint conference between the UN community and the geospatial intelligence community. And it was at a point where, GIA just opened up data access. And there was just this fascinating, very heartfelt debate going on from the aid community who had railed against, the intelligence community for years and years and years because they wanted them to share the data. And then, of course, the intelligence community did open up some of that data, and then the aid community could see evidence of atrocity. And wow, then they had some kind of compulsion to act, right? Because they have the information. So what do you do about it? So we had this whole different debate. But that issue around opening up the data and sharing the data was, in the history books. And I suspect we're going to head towards a similar point. Of course, there will always be some areas of data sharing that will be quite tightly locked down. But I think it needs to change quite soon. And I think our realization of that needing to change will come quite soon too.
Yeah, I agree. And it also brings to question which data and how transparent do we get and who do we share it with. So I think with that, Megan and Laura, I guess with your breadth of experience in the wireless and telecom space, what do you see as far as data sharing and kind of some of the things that Karen and Dr. Bunn are talking about as far as sharing this data?
I think there's a common intention to develop some sort of common set of guidelines around the types of data and common baseline around what we expect in terms of how these pieces of equipment move in space. I think there's a common intention towards that. I think we see other use cases like through GPP and other aspects of so that the tech and telecom industry space where there are opportunities for the private sector to weigh in and create that standard setting body that creates a baseline of rules but doesn't stifle innovation. I think overall, when we're looking at, when folks are weighing in on this, that's what they're thinking about, ways that we can develop a common set of rules that doesn't stifle innovation.
Yeah, I mean, so my thoughts are the private sector is obviously motivated, right? Because they want to get to market. And to Alice's point about looking at history, if there's a will, there's a way, right? That I see folks coming together and one way or the other figure out a way where they can comfortably share what needs to be shared so that they can do what they need to do in the marketplace. I saw a question come in related to what China's doing, and so during this conversation, I'm just kind of thinking about that, and obviously, you can't just talk about certain parts of the world when it comes to most space issues, right? You have to talk about everything that's going on in the world. And y- I think we might need to be working on at a more international, perhaps UN level, kind of better international cooperation and discussion than the state of what we have right now. It's been, I think the Outer Space Treaty was made in the 1970s. So it's been quite a long time where the major players have kind of come together and come to an agreement. And I don't know if we'll get to anything like that anytime soon, but I think we have to the private sector has to kind of work to encourage that type of discussion and cooperation again as we're talking about space traffic management.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And it's interesting, right? Because the question for the audience, the question that came through in the Q&A meeting chat was what regulatory measures are might be triggered by China's intention of launching 200,000 satellites. So uh, now, and I think something that we saw here in the U.S. Not necessarily for China. I think it was a different mega constellation, potentially SpaceX. We did see the FCC. Um, uh, I don't know if I want to say pump the brakes, but kind of break up the ask into, I believe, two parts. With one part getting approval for launch, and the second part being, a slightly kind of updated version. So it does seem that it might be country dependent at this point. Um, I guess, Laura, Megan, have you seen kind of a global response as far as the different mega constellations um, with what they've um, kind of pitched as far as, or uh, sorry, lost my train of thought here. I guess, has the group seen kind of any changes in how things might be done globally when these kind of mega constellation launch intentions are made? And then we have that US example of the FCC kind of sometimes pumping the brakes a bit.
I think it's more coming from a political lens and a technical lens when it comes to some of those things. I think obviously there are a number of sort of competing mega constellations that are coming to the U.S. for permission, or the FCC for permission. I think we all know that Project Kuiper has a large mandate, and they're sort of at the beginning and edge of deploying those satellites. I think when we are thinking about that action with the FCC, I think that's a response to I think they want. I don't want to say they're taking a wait and see approach, but I think they want to see what is going to happen when more of these satellites are being deployed and what kind of traffic issues are going to come into play. I think it's more of a managing how many satellites are being deployed at a time, and then also, like I said, the political dynamics between these massive companies, right? And the reality of the impact that they have on the U.S. economy. If I can kind of speak, just broadly on it.
I I guess I would just say, again, I think that's why programs like tracks are so important, not only from that technical standpoint, but from a fostering innovation standpoint. Like if you have robust programs like that, they can send conjunction alerts and really track this, not just for the mega constellations, right? But for the university that's launching their first satellite, for the first international country, name your country that's launching their satellites for the first time. Those are really kind of the players that, usually need more assistance. And it's, I think, no one, I shouldn't say no one, but most don't have nefarious intentions, right? They're all trying to figure out space, innovate for their countries or universities or for science. And having a program like Tracks that can really assist in that is important. I think the mega constellations sometimes get a bad rap because it's scary because you see like thousands, Starlink, thousands of satellites. Um, but, from where we sit, they're pretty responsible operators. They've got a lot of capital on the line in these constellations, like you mentioned, made from an economic standpoint. So we're seeing companies like that really integrate more maneuverability, AI, technologies on their satellites themselves to really prevent collisions and to do those maneuvers more effectively. Um, so again, I think it's certainly a worthy topic to talk about the mega constellations, but also I think we have to remember like some of the more, I guess I would say risky satellites are often not the mega constellations. And we want to continue to foster that innovation, not hinder it with regulation.
Yeah, it's really interesting, isn't it? It's as you say, you want to find a way to really, really pull through as much innovation as you can, but in a kind of do no harm way. Uh, Again, I'm reminded of probably about 10 years ago actually, when we were starting to see technologies come on board for debris removal and starting to see that coming through. And on the one hand, you say, well, hey, this is fantastic, right? This is exactly what we need, and it'll secure the future of the environment. On the other hand, you say, "This is terrifying." You know, what are we doing here? And, in the UK, we ended up developing a sort of traffic light system. So when there were these more riskier technologies, that, could do harm, in fact, as well as they were designed to do good, we came up with a traffic light system. So basically, you needed 3 checks in the box, and you got your first check in the box if you used a tried and tested launcher, you got your second check in the box if you used a tried and tested platform, and you got your third check in the box if you were orbiting at about 400 kilometers or below, because that meant that you had time to prove your technology, but also that, your kit would naturally burn up on re-entry and you wouldn't leave that lasting presence. So finding, like navigating a path through, which does really pull through the innovation, but making sure that, we don't mess up the environment for everyone else in the process, I think will be key. I mean, another thing that I think is quite interesting, particularly as regards, space domain awareness, space traffic awareness, space traffic management rather, is, the coming on board of onboard sensors. So that's enabling the industry to get some very, very, uh, detailed information about their specific orbiting environment, which is, of course, most specifically interesting to them. But then if there is some kind of program that enables the wider data sharing of that information, perhaps at a slightly less precise level, then I think that can benefit a wider community as well. So I'm quite excited to see where that goes.
That is some you brought up kind of debris mitigation too and deorbiting satellites. And I think that's just as important and more. I think it's in the new NPRM language, right? Where there's remind me that there is deorbit language, and you have to have a plan on debris mitigation, making sure you're not leaving those bodies in space for. I think it used to be what 25 years was the regulation, and then it went down to 5. LeoLabs has always advocated more. You should have to deorbit defunct satellites within a year. And I think again, those rules are certainly worth some regulatory language.
I mean, the FCC's been trying to tweak the orbital debris showing requirements um, for probably at least the last 10 years. And during this time, there's always been a conversation as to whether it actually has authority to deal with orbital debris in this way. And they've always said, well, we have the licensing authority, so we'll just connect it with that. And they've been able to go forward and continue to regulate this area. And yes, in the NPRM notice of proposed rulemaking, they're continuing to look at those issues. And part of the rule change is to try to give more regulatory certainty in terms of the timing of processing of licenses, applications, and trying to make a larger number of applications more fast track than what they currently do. And so trying to have more lines in the sand with regard to the orbital debris showing is one way that they want to look and do that. And then they also are proposing to do conditional authorizations where they could have give you a license with the condition that you have to do additional things. And that could be coordination with others. It also could be like doing an updated or final orbital debris showing to show that you actually can meet the requirements before you're allowed to launch, or at least allowed to operate. Again, these are all proposed rules and they're still in the midst of taking comments. So we're the long way to go to see where this all ends up. But certainly the Space Bureau, the FCC, is trying to think ahead and trying to reshape the rules to be as friendly to the private sector as they can be, and try to make things more transparent, easier for everyone, and we'll see where that comes.
Do you think that, and I guess just a question, but it reminds me of, my time at Maxar. We spent so much time trying to streamline the remote sensing regulatory rules from OSC and the Department of Commerce. Much of my gray hair was from that time. Um, but a big thing we pushed was that kind of streamlining, more automatic approvals for standard capabilities or capabilities that were on orbit, or even we were pushing for, more of a fast track if the capability existed internationally, right? Because we didn't want to hinder US companies. But do you see a path to fast track those licenses, Laura? Like, is that really in the art of the possible? And I guess, is it in the best interest of space to fast track those licenses, or do you have concerns there?
I think the staff has knows where things get hung up, right? So that they're trying to make rules that would make things easier. It, I don't know how far that's actually going to get, because in the past they currently have fast track rules for small sats, but I think there's like 12 rules, and if you can't meet every single one exactly, then you don't get the fast track, and it's going to take a while. So the proof will be in the pudding. I wouldn't say I'm entirely hopeful that we're going to see this wholesale change that's going to make things much easier, but they're taking a hard look at it and they're trying. So we'll see.
I think it's a really interesting question. And I think it's also a really interesting question to Laura. You mentioned it about, what is the body that we can get alignment here, right? Because at the end of the day, it's no one country that can solve this. It is a critical mass of countries, working together. And how do we incentivize people to adopt things which could, on the face of it, look anti-competitive? right? If we're asking industry to do more. And, we know regulation shopping is a thing. So people can just go and get licensed elsewhere. Again, I hope we would get to the point where you would be able to achieve that critical mass of countries. I think it's been a very, very, um, I think the UN environment is very, very challenging to do that. And that's why we've ended up with some very low thresholds for action, 25 years for deorbit in the past, because it's quite difficult to get everyone to agree.
Right. But someone could do regulatory shopping, right? But just because you have a license doesn't mean you have access to spectrum. And so that goes to the UN, and depending on your system, your design, your spectrum needs, that might be the point where you get hung up.
Yeah, I guess so. But then there's because we haven't talked about spectrum very much either, have we? I mean, I think again, we've got some catching up to do. Spectrum is such a finite resource now, and arguably some of the ways in which we have certain organizations using spectrum, sitting on spectrum bands rather than taking the maximum potential from that band, or indeed freeing up that band for someone else's use, is perhaps something that we should look at a little bit more closely. It's always my first law of space. Whatever you think the problem is, whatever you really think it is, whatever technology, whatever launch, whatever, it's always spectrum, right? It's like the first law of space is always like your critical issue is always going to come back to being spectrum, but we don't talk about it that much.
Right, and that actually it makes a good point, because even if the FCC succeeds in making licensing really easy and streamlined, again, depending on your use case, presumably you're going to want to operate not just over the U.S. but in all other parts of the world. You're still going to have to deal with the um, the UN and international uh, organizations, and also perhaps a country by country basis to get your approvals to do what you need to do.
And I think another thing just to add around the FCC and kind of investigating or thinking about how quickly some of these rule changes are happening. I think that the political posture of Chairman Carr is to reduce regulation generally, but there are also two empty seats at the FCC. They do have a quorum, but it could be interesting to see if, for example, we get a Republican commissioner that's, very space friendly, whether that has any impact on some of these issues being prioritized at the FCC. So I think, outside some of the technical dynamics and thinking about this globally, it's, thinking about the FCC and how those kind of political dynamics might change before the President Trump's term is up.
I mean, for me, I think I'm thinking more of how much influence the administration has over the FCC. Uh, it's technically considered an independent agency. There's been some holes poked in that by the Supreme Court, and might be some more. We'll see what happens. But certainly, the chairman's office has shown that they are very supportive of what the White House wants to do, which goes back to my original opening remarks, talking about what the executive order on space, and then what the Space Bureau is doing, and that there might be tension between these two.
Absolutely, totally agree. And we've seen, in past commissions, when even on along party lines, sometimes you do sort of get a wild card commissioner that is willing to push back against the administration, whether it be Democrat or Republican. So once again, I completely agree with that. And I think, that influences another dynamic as we think about how some of this regulation might change and how space might be prioritized.
Yeah, I think those are all good points. And it does seem, at least in the US, that most organizations and the current administration are at least aligned in having kind of space come first, right? for the U.S. Alice, what are you seeing in your part of the world? I guess, do you see or feel kind of similar things, or do you see kind of the interactions between executive branch and legislative or industry groups? How do you see that playing out where you are?
Would say, I mean, I mentioned it earlier, definitely the profile of space as a, as enabler of delivering the connectivity we also desperately crave nowadays. That awareness has definitely gone up. I think, in humility, there is still a challenge about space. It's always an interesting thing, isn't it? Because I would say it's like two sides of the same coin. On the one hand, it is a fantastically exciting, high profile sector to work in because everyone knows rockets and astronauts, right? But then when you're trying to talk about space for those fundamental down to earth benefits and you're delivering capabilities that we all rely on, there's far, far less awareness. So, from my perspective, there is still much, much more to be done on raising the general awareness of space. And that's true for the general public. And that when the general public are on side, then, government ministers will be too, because ultimately they have to deliver the will of the people. And if people appreciate how fundamental space is to their everyday lives, that will help us. In many respects, Starlink has now a very high profile, and that has helped us too. Okay, at the top level, anyone operating around the world who is raising the profile of how valuable and useful space capability is helping us all. Okay, and at the level down, we all get into competition. But there we go. At the top level, we've definitely got something to work with. So, in humility, certainly in the UK, the profile of space isn't as high as it is in the US. And we've got our work cut out to make sure it gets up there.
Dr. Bunn, do you see, this kind of march toward more sovereign systems or sort of this move away from US capability a little bit across Europe? Maybe this is more on the national security side, but do you feel like this year will kind of be that turning point of awareness of space capabilities and just particularly as again, you're just seeing more demand for sovereign space capabilities across Europe?
Generally, I mean, it's a geopolitical observation, isn't it? It's not just in the UK, it's around the world that,
Yeah.
there's a resurgence in non-alignment, right? People don't want to necessarily just be aligned with the superpower of the day, if I can put it that way. People are much more interested in having sovereign capability. Now, again, the UK is never going to match the US in budgets, right? I'm not breaking any confidences by saying this. However, I firmly believe that the UK has got capabilities which should be very, very strategically valuable to our international partners. And for me, the way forward is, national capability and international partnerships are two sides of the same coin. You're never going to be a meaningful international partner unless you have some national capability to bring to the table. I think the challenge for the UK is to be very, very um, uh, forensic about what that capability is. I've got some ideas. Partly they're connected to geography, and partly they're connected to, a rich history of academic excellence and, operational forecasting capability. So I'm thinking of things like space weather. I'm thinking of things like space domain awareness, the things that everybody needs in order to, help their infrastructure operate safely. And I think true for the UK, but I think for, many international allies, your starting point has to really, really forensically analyze where you have something that your key partners want. And yes, you can exploit that nationally for your own benefit, but it will also um, put together a framework where we can all help the stability of our shared operating environment.
Yeah. I think that makes a lot of sense. And ladies, thank you for joining us today. This discussion has been awesome. I feel like we could go on probably for another hour. But with that, a quick kind of 2-minute warning bell. Please let's kind of go around for final closing remarks, and then we're going to turn it back over to Tamara.
Okay. Maybe I'll kick it off. But again, just wanted to thank you all. I hadn't gotten the chance to do something like this with SSPI, so I just really appreciate the opportunity. I think maybe I'll close with Katina. You had asked in some of our prep like what kind of keeps us up at night. It's not to end on a bad note. Other than my 3 children, it's really the collision in space, right? It's the accident that um I don't want to wait, I guess, for the accident or the big collision to start making some of these policies right. My fear is it will take something like that in order to get the kind of international community to act here. So, um, I just really appreciate this organization and my fellow panelists here that are continuing this conversation and keeping it top of mind for policymakers in this administration because it really is an important topic. But
I just wanted to once again thank you so much for inviting me to speak with these ladies. This has been a fantastic conversation. I've learned so much even in this conversation, and I'm definitely grateful for SSPI for the platform and opportunity. I think I'm most interested or what I'm excited about is, just kind of seeing what's going to happen with some of this spectrum allocation and how it'll impact the broader options and consumer choice and their abilities to have these options and access to the different technology. I think, as you mentioned, Katina, a lot of times they don't know how the magic switch is turned on. But I think as professionals in this space, we know how important it is for there to be robust competition and different options and different technology at play. So I'm very interested to see how the U.S. and others will address the 6G race and also managing traffic of space and making sure satellite has a seat at that table.
Just think the conversation underscores how really difficult it is to be a successful satellite operator. And, it takes years of planning ahead, dealing with political issues in terms of getting both the WRC, you get spectrum, at FCC or your regulator to get your license, and all you're dealing with orbital debris and designing your system to comply, and now more and more you're dealing with space traffic issues. So I think, kudos to everybody who's a startup and is trying to get things underway. It's a lot of work, but I think it's really fulfilling when you get your birds up and actually provide a meaningful service.
And thank you, obviously, from me as well. Thank you, especially as for welcoming me on the panel. I think the only non-US person on the panel, so that's great. I suppose my kind of hopeful shot for the future is that I hope that international partnerships continue to be the key ingredient for our success in space. Looking around, it's not a political comment, but looking around the world, geopolitically, it's a pretty strange place at the moment. So I hope through our sector, we will continue to find the wherewithal to cooperate together. And who knows, there might even be spillovers for broader, better cooperation across countries around the world. But we can set the benchmark through our space cooperation.
Absolutely. And thank you each for joining us today and for the awesome discussion. Tamara?
Thank you so much, everyone. Can everybody please give a round of applause to our panelists and to our esteemed moderator, who did not tell me how to pronounce her last name, just for the record. So just, just, just pointing that out. I want to take a moment. We're right at 12 o'clock, so I'm going to ask everyone if you just please give me just a moment. Last week we lost a legend, and I'm just going to take a little bit of moment to share a little bit about her. Dr. Gladys West was inducted into the Hall of Fame in 2021 or 2022. I don't remember which year. I apologize. But she was such a dear, and we were so grateful to be able to induct her into the Hall of Fame. She was indeed a hidden figure of our industry. There was a great movie about the hidden figures that helped us get to the moon. Dr. Gladys West has helped us make GPS. She was our satellite hidden figure, and we lost her on the 17th of January. I actually had the great privilege of interviewing Gladys, and I'm gonna share. Let's see if I can do it. Yeah, I'm gonna share my YouTube interview with Gladys. If anybody wishes to check that out, she was so lovely, and this year at the Night of Excellence, we will take a moment to honor all of the Hall of Famers that we lost this year. We've lost four, and hopefully that'll be it before the Night of Excellence happens March 24th. But watch this space as we tell you a little bit more, just so that you know, the Night of Excellence is March 24th at the Satellite Show, and it'll be preceded from 6:30 to 7:30 with the WISE welcoming reception. So, so I hope to see most of you there. And so with that, thank you so much for being here. Thank you to all of our panelists. Katina, thank you for organizing this. And we look forward to seeing you next month.